Hello and welcome. This week we've celebrated the Feast of the Transfiguration. It's struck me that during this last century, the fact that the Transfiguration takes place on August the 6th, which was the same day that the atom bomb was dropped on Japan, is more than just a coincidence of dates, because it gives us a model of two extraordinary versions of, if you like, nuclear power. One is the nuclear power of destruction, the white light that burns people alive and chars them forever. And the other is the nuclear power of holiness, which illuminates, refreshes and revivifies in the love and light of God. And it's almost as if we're presented with a choice as humanity between these two types of transfiguration, one wholly destructive and terribly evil, and the other wholly good and very beautiful. In fact, in the middle of this culture war that we're in, both a culture war and a civil war in the church, the meaning of the Transfiguration should help us clarify what some of the issues are, because essentially it's a vision of holiness, of purity, and of beauty and of life. The people of God, the first people of the first covenant, were an experiment in holiness. It's no so great surprise that they were taught to wash a great deal on the outside, because the washing on the outside was intended to mirror a cleanliness on the inside. It's very interesting occasionally when you see some clergy, some Christians, who often have faces that look like they've been washed. At first sight, it's as if they've been washed physically, but then you notice that actually what you're really seeing is the washing internally, a spiritual washing, a spiritual cleanliness. There is a balance, an interrelationship between what we do on the outside and what takes place on the inside. And we have a clash of two models, two utopianisms perhaps. One is of trying to reorganize the relationship between people in society in terms of justice and fairness, the bringing in of people on the outside, the reconfiguring of our relationships together in a way that mirrors something more beautiful and less fractured and broken. But on the other side we have the call to holiness. And it's my sense that what Christianity intends us to understand is that if you don't deal with the source of the river, you can't possibly expect the lower down in the river to reflect the beauty and the quality and the integrity of the clean water. In other words, we have to make holiness our priority. And we find that, of course, in so many ways in the life of Christ, but particularly in the teaching of the Lord's Prayer, where he begins by inviting us to have a relationship with the unknowable God who created the universe and call him Father. And then as we reflect on our Father in heaven, beyond us, outside the reach of time and space, the first thing we do is to approach him with the notion of holiness in our minds. What is holiness? For me, I often think of Isaiah chapter 6 and the vision there where Isaiah sees the Lord high and lifted up with his train filling the temple, and the cherubim and the seraphim in this great holy smoke overwhelmingly calling, Holy, holy, holy. On the Mount of Transfiguration, when Jesus was transfigured and became white, his face was white and his clothes were white too, the disciples were suddenly overwhelmed and fell on their faces with fear. Peter began to babble and to talk nonsense. Luke is very concerned we should know the timing of this event, and he talks about it being both close to the period when Peter made his declaration, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God," and at the same time the Feast of Tabernacles, which reflected the Jews wandering about in the desert being taken care of by the living God. It reflects too Moses climbing Mount Sinai, climbing into the cloud and encountering the presence of God, and there too finding his face and his clothes shining with a bright light that people couldn't look on. This sense of encountering God and being touched by his holiness goes right to the heart of describing what our relationship with God involves. It was interesting that Isaiah's first reaction when he encountered the Lord high and lifted up was to have a sense of his own unworthiness, his dirtiness, his sense that he needed washing and cleansing. He received a burning coal carried by one of the angels to purge his lips, which had been the source of unclean words, expressing unclean thoughts. And he received purgation, a cleansing, a burning away. We might need that same cauterizing, burning away for all that is unholy, except that it's accomplished by Jesus on the cross. It's done by his blood, of his sacrifice, which we receive in the mystery and the miracle of the Holy Mass, or else we might need such cauterizing ourselves. I had a friend who wrote to me the other day, and thank you, by the way, for those of you who write to me to give some response to what we do here. He was a musician. He was a music critic. He's in his 70s now. He used to sing in choirs. He used to be also a very nice and generous liberal member of the Church of England's General Synod. But he wrote to me to say effectively he'd lost his faith. He still believed in existence, he says, and beauty, the beauty of music in particular. But he didn't want to complicate it by believing in God. I'm praying and thinking about how to write back to him, but I think I'm going to invite him to reflect on Jesus and to say that none of us would know what to think about God if it wasn't for the fact of having a relationship with Jesus. And that really goes to the heart of what Christianity is. Again, it's not the adoption of a series of propositional truths that we can or can't prove. It's actually a relationship. It's a relationship that grows and takes us on a journey. And that relationship starts when we encounter Jesus in the text of the New Testament. And we come across moments like this Transfiguration, and we realize we're not just dealing with an inspirational figure, a prophet, a holy person, somebody inspirationally out of the ordinary. We're actually dealing with the miraculous interface between humanity and the living God who both made us and comes in Jesus to save us. What do you do with the Jesus of the Transfiguration? A Jesus whose face and clothes shine with this unbelievably pure and overwhelming light. What do you do with the Jesus who takes you on a journey far beyond the normal limitations of our own understanding, and as he takes us begins to change us and make us different, to transform us so we're no longer conformed to the world and reflect the ongoing brokenness of humanity with all the spiritual septicemia that we're so full of, but instead forgives us and transforms us. And indeed, for those who take up the need for the priority of holiness in this culture war, this civil war in the church, over the utopian reorganization of political and sociological relationships, is precisely because, having been forgiven and loved and accepted, the experience we have overflows, can't be contained anymore in our hearts, and we have to share it with other people. And as we share the forgiveness and the compassion and the kindness of God with people who don't deserve it any more than we deserved it when we were given it, so our own relationships, sociologically, existentially, change. That's how you mend human relationships, by drawing people into the presence of the living God who changes us and allows that change to overflow and topple into the lives of others. I was listening the other day to a number of people who are involved in the culture wars, mainly from the left, talking about the way in which they were shocked that they'd been deprived of any objective standard of what was good and what was evil. They were talking essentially, to begin with, of projects that mattered to them. They were very concerned about the dignity of women and were astonished at what they thought were struggles that they'd won on behalf of the dignity of women were being completely overturned as women were denigrated as TERFs by the trans movement. The rights and the dignity of feminists and feminism and women in general was suddenly being trampled by this next stage of the culture wars and the progressiveness of the woke agenda. They noticed the same thing was happening to some homosexuals, that teenagers who might have been homosexual, they may not have remained homosexual, of course, but they might have done, instead of being allowed to be homosexual, were being pressurized into having gender reassignment surgery, in which they were mutilated and, of course, unable to bear children. And that as they discovered what the progressive agenda was doing in the whole ideology of the trans movement, trampling both on the space that emerging homosexual people might want to explore for themselves, and on the rights of women, that actually the good and the evil of progressive politics had become profoundly obscure to them. And they began to say, perhaps we shouldn't have closed the door on Christians and on Christianity, because Christians and Christianity, one of the gifts they do is that they bring an objective scale of moral virtue by which we can judge things. And unless we believe in absolute truth, they said, we can't distinguish between good and evil. Now, whatever we think of the trans movement, whatever we think of feminism and of gay culture, let's suspend that for a moment. But let's recognize that what they thought was a virtuous movement was in fact being destroyed by itself because of the whole culture of relativism and postmodernity. And suddenly they found themselves longing for a community of people that believed in absolute truth and believed in a scale of moral virtues by which we could begin to have the kind of conversations we need to have in order to distinguish between good and evil. I've said it on a number of occasions, but I think it bears a lot of repeating, that one of the great problems of having any kind of discrimination outlawed in our culture philosophically is that the gift of discrimination, the practice of discrimination, is precisely what we have to operate in order to discriminate between good and evil, between light and dark, between truth and untruth. And if we can't discriminate, then we can't do this most basic and most important of moral tasks that all human beings have to do, being made in the image of God, and being all of us being moved by a profound sense of wanting to distinguish between good and evil. There's an extremely funny and poignant skit about two Nazis in this humorous sketch, and one of them saying to the other, "Are we the bad guys?" Because, of course, Nazism thought itself to be a virtuous movement. Everyone thinks they're doing good, and the capacity to distinguish between good and evil cannot be taken for granted. It is, in fact, one of the most difficult things we have to do as human beings. But it's made almost impossible by having the capacity and the responsibility for discrimination outlawed. And so at last, part of the progressive community in our society has begun to notice that without any notion of absolute truth, without a rejection of all kinds of relativism, it's impossible to do the primary job of distinguishing between good and evil. This is the point, I think, where the church is in a position to say, you need to ask us back. You've misunderstood us. We're not here to guilt you out. We're not here to press you into believing things you don't want to believe. What we're here to do is to introduce you to what we've discovered. It's that lovely phrase that evangelism is simply one beggar telling another hungry beggar where he can find some bread. Well, we are people who are desperate for the truth, telling people who are very confused about the truth and becoming desperate for the truth, where they can find the truth. And the truth, of course, is not necessarily simply in a proposition, but it's in a person. It's in Jesus. It's in the encounter with Jesus that we discover both the way and the truth and the life. The Feast of the Transfiguration is one of those moments when we discover that Jesus wasn't simply a good man, wasn't just another teacher, but instead we're taken into a depth of the reality of God as he comes to meet us in the incarnate Word that we couldn't have imagined, we couldn't have invented for ourselves. As we try and be faithful to Christ and tell the world who he is and why they need him, so we're meeting a very profound need. We're speaking into a vacuum of compassion, a vacuum of truth, a vacuum of security. All the things that God gives human beings through a relationship with his Son. Above all, a sense of identity, who we are, what we're doing here. A sense of being loved and forgiven, which we so desperately need to deal with the unholiness that mars our life, our actions, and our reflexes. A sense of limitless forgiveness that we can never exhaust so long as we fall on our knees and ask for mercy. And having received, we then offer to other people and build up the virtuous circle of forgiveness and compassion that is the antidote to the vicious circles that the fallen world exemplifies and continues. This graced feast day of the Transfiguration is a reminder that Jesus is bigger than anyone we can imagine, but it's a reminder too that we are invited into this process of transfiguration, that God intends to make us holy. He intends to wash our faces, to wash our souls, to cleanse our hearts, and to draw us away from the darkness, away from the brokenness, away from the confusion, away from the despair, into the light and the love and the certainty of belonging to him, of being forgiven, and being invited past the constraints of space and time into a quality of life that is marked by ecstasy and joy and love. It is Christ who makes this possible. It's Christ in whom we see all this. It's Christ who does it all for us. And as we celebrate his transfiguration and have in mind the terrible mock nuclear reaction that human beings are capable of as they set out to destroy each other, our gratitude for Christ deepens and feeds our love and our praise for him.